Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the September 2021 presentation of the Chicago Map Society. My name is Curtis Wright, president of CMS. And for those of you who aren't aware, next month marks the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire. We're very excited to commemorate that momentous disaster just a few weeks early with a prominent local scholar, Professor Carl Smith, who just released a book on the subject. But first, I have a few announcements. By now, you probably have noticed that we remain in a digital environment. No appetizers or stiff chairs in Ruggles Hall. We probably won't get to enjoy those amenities again until at least December. But we're hoping to put together a really special silent auction show and tell for our members, who all have undoubtedly endured a lot over the past year and a half. However, our organizational mechanisms proceed as usual, and in November, we'll have our annual elections for the board of directors. So if you have any interest in joining the board or becoming more active in CMS in general, please drop us a line at contact@chicagomapsociety.org. In case you didn't see the email, there are a lot of interesting virtual events in the upcoming month or so. The Virginia Garrett lectures will focus on the mapping of Africa. There's an MCOS symposium in Belgium about that country's significant contributions to the history of cartography. The California Map Society annual meeting in the Barry Ruderman Cartography Conference on Indigenous Mapping will all be taking place within the next 30 days or so. Next month's CMS program, which again will remain virtual, stays local, and we will be focusing on the development of Chicago's expressway system. Keep an eye on your email for further information, and please email us if you have any questions or suggestions. Now, on to the main event. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carl Smith, the Franklyn Bliss Snyder Professor of English and American Studies and Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern University. Dr. Smith earned his PhD from Yale and has been teaching at Northwestern since 1972. He's written a number of books and articles on various topics, many of which relate to Chicago, such as The Plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham in the Remaking of the American City, Urban Disorder and the Shape of Belief, the Great Chicago Fire, the Haymarket Bomb, and the Model Town of Pullman, and Chicago and the American Literary Imagination, 1880 to 1920. Tonight, he will be sharing some of his research from his latest work, Chicago's Great Fire, The Destruction and Resurrection of an Iconic American City, published by Grove Atlantic and available online and from local booksellers. Dr. Smith will be joined by our very own Dennis McClendon, professional cartographer, eminent local historian, host of the Chicago and Maps website, and owner of Chicago Cartographics. Many of you know Dennis from his previous CMS presentations and regular attendance, but he's also been featured on WTTW's Ask Jeffrey, WBEZ, and a variety of other outlets. Dennis created the maps for Dr. Smith's books and will be able to provide some interesting professional insight into the mapping of the fire. As usual, our presentation will be recorded and we will have time for question and answers at the end. And without further ado, I'll hand the presentation over to Carl and Dennis. Thank you again.
Hi, thank you very much. Curtis and I discussed what I might talk about for this talk. And we agreed that while I'll talk about the book and the fire, we thought given this audience, I'd talk about the fire in relation to maps. I realized as soon as I agreed to do that, that I might be talking about a subject that my audience knew better than I did. But then I also realized, as Curtis explained, that I had a kind of plant among you in one of your members, Dennis McClendon, who could greatly enrich this presentation. And I asked Curtis if that would be okay, and he said yes, and then Dennis agreed. Let me explain. I've known Dennis for decades. And he's one of the 2 or 3 people I've learned the most from about Chicago, not just in terms of just information, but just the whole way of seeing the city that I just didn't appreciate and understand before, and whole ways of also, of course, looking at maps. And I'm basically a word person. I'm very grateful. Well, given his knowledge, and of course, the fact that he's a professional cartographer, there was a no-brainer to ask him when I wrote this book to do the maps for the book. I knew that would such maps would be absolutely necessary, even for people who know Chicago. There's just a lot of detailed information about places and so on that people would just not really get a visual sense of where and what was happening without those maps. And Dennis supplied them. I'll add that his ideas, while there was no particular tension, his ideas of what maps could do for the book were far more ambitious than mine. Mine were mostly informational and more mundane. He may talk about things he might do. There could be a whole book on Chicago and mapping. I might say that in the feedback I get from readers, they talk about how absolutely essential and important and valuable the maps are, to such an extent I get a little jealous. I want to say, how about the actual text of the book? I say, yeah, that's okay too, but we really like the maps. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to turn to the fire and maps, and then ask Dennis to make a few remarks on his own, and then we'll go into the Q&A. With any luck, I can slip to the side and listen to him and the members talk about all this. Well, there's several different kinds of books on the Great Chicago Fire. Now I'm going to share my screen for a while. There's several different kinds of books on the Great Chicago Fire, but remarkably, even after 150 years, Chicago's Great Fire is the first broadly researched, carefully documented narrative history of the fire and the reconstruction of the city after the fire. And it includes about 70 illustrations, as well as the 7 maps that Dennis made for the book. Roughly the first half of the book is about the fire, the destruction of Chicago. Here we see a lithograph of the city on fire. The panic in the streets, a drawing from a contemporary news weekly, illustrated weekly. People fleeing. This is from Harper's Weekly, the rush for life over the Randolph Street Bridge. There are many versions of this, but this is the original. And then, of course, what the city was like after the fire. One of the many pictures of ruins in the book, and this is the one from the cover of State and Madison after the fire. The streetcars have started to run again. The rubble is still there, and you see bricks being collected for reuse over here. The second half of the book is about the rebuilding, focusing on the tumultuous period that ended in the fall of 1873. With a very substantial rebuilding of the city. And it only ended then, and only basically paused then, because not of anything was happening in Chicago, but of the terrible national panic of 1873, which lasted through much of the rest of the decade. But I talk about things like the people sending aid to Chicago as the city was actually burning. Here's Jim Fisk, the New York financier, with a wagon full of goods that are being sent to be put on a train to be sent to Chicago. The martial law, the quite irregular and illegal martial law in the city under General Philip Sheridan at the time, that ended with an accidental murder and only was lifted then. The distribution of aid, which was very, very controversial. And then, of course, the rebuilding itself. The famous W.D. Kerfoot, a realtor's shack on Washington Street, just west of where City Hall is now, getting going again amidst the rubble. Then the slow rebuilding of the city, starting with these wood frame buildings on the east side of Michigan Avenue in what is now Grant Park. And you could see at that point, but you could see the bareness of the trees, all the trees that burned, and that Michigan Avenue at that point was still a unpaved street. Culminating in 1873 with a great fair to celebrate the rebuilding of Chicago, the Interstate Exposition in this 3-cupola building on the east side of Michigan Avenue, where Adams sits it, on the very same site where the Art Institute of Chicago sits today. This building was there for about 20 years and then was torn down to make way for the Art Institute. The final chapter talks about the place in the fire's history. I'm sorry, the culmination even goes on farther to the World's Columbian Exposition. The final chapter talks about the place of the fire in the city's history, and the book begins and ends with the story of Mrs. OLeary here, the 1935 painting by Norman Rockwell, which he said was perhaps the worst painting he ever did, not because it was such a bad painting, but it was because it was on a calendar, and who wants to look at the rear end of a cow for 12 months? Getting back to the book as a whole, there's a map story here that I tell in another book of a year after the fire, when the revival of the city was assured, of a leading minister, Baptist minister named W.W. Everts, was giving a sermon on the anniversary of the fire called "The Lesson of the Disaster," and he took as his text, "The Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord God loved thee." And he told the story of a Chicago man traveling in Switzerland before the fire, seeing on the wall a map of the United States, and it had Milwaukee on it, but not Chicago. Heaven forbid. And he said, then he asked the congregation, "Do you think another map will be published on the globe without Chicago?" His obvious answer was no, that the fire put Chicago on the international map. Well, there's lots of self-congratulation here, and while a lot of it is justified, much of the book talks about how bumpy the rebuilding and the recovery were. Much more complicated than in the popular myth of the Phoenix City. The fire revealed and deepened certain social divisions, mostly those related to class and ethnicity in the city. It's a city that's virtually half people foreign born, and close to 80% who have at least one foreign born parent, but most of the property owned by a white Protestant New York and New England based elite for the most part. And while the fire and the rebuilding accelerated to the good certain aspects of Chicago's progress, it also led to certain social disorders and violence in the decades ahead, including things like the Chicago chapters of the National Railroad strike of 1877, the Haymarket bombing of 1886, and the Pullman strike of 1894. In some ways, the conflicts that come out of the fire are still going on in those. This is a narrative history. It's a story. It emphasizes incident and character. It makes the most of primary sources, over 150 different personal accounts, lots and lots of newspaper accounts, all kinds of other documents, and tries to tell the story as people experience both the destruction and the rebuilding as much as possible in their own words. And this includes not just this white male elite, or native-born elite, but children, women, immigrants, working people, and it tries to do so in a richly engrossing way, in which all the documentation helps push the story along, not get in its way. And I'm very gratified by all the reviews that say how well it reads. But you can judge for yourself, of course. Well, let's get to our focus on maps. I want to start with Dennis's maps. Since they were to be in the pages of the book, they'd have to be black and white and limited by the size of the page, but Dennis also prepared some in color that I'll show you here. Also, for budgetary reasons, we had to limit to, I might add, limited visual imagination, had to limit it to 7 essential maps. But these have a kind of visual symmetry to them and tell the story themselves. And I'll go through them with you. First, looking at the city before the fire in a larger sense, the most important takeaways here is how much smaller the city was in 1871 than it would be later, about 1/6 of the size of its current size, with the northern border at Fullerton. The western one is now Pulaski, the southern one at Pershing Road. We decided, for the sake of legibility, to use contemporary, not modern street names, not the ones at the time. And also to show how the city is divided into its 3 divisions by the branches of the river. That how many parts of the city that are now part of it were outside it at the time of the fire. Then we looked at basically the central city, again, to give people a sense of how the the river divides the city into its three sections, and also to orient them of where the downtown was and the city hall, then called the courthouse, but also such things as the 1857 fire that convinced the city to go to a to a professional fire department that did terrible damage over here. And then also, just as important, the fire, the Great Chicago Fire started on Sunday, October 8th, 1871. But one reason it did so much damage was because the fire department was very weakened by fighting a major fire the night before, the so-called Saturday Night Fire. And that's over here. And down here is the location of the OLeary house and barn, to give you a sense of where it is in relation to the city, and also such other things as at this time, as many of you probably already know, the lake came all the way up, virtually all the way up to Michigan Avenue. There was only a very thin suggestion of a park there. And the Illinois Central, since the 1850s, had permission to put its tracks on a trestle over here in exchange for building a breakwater outside it, which created this lagoon here. And we see also but in late 1860s, the new water system, the water tower, and the pumping station where they are now. Then the fire comes. Here we see the fire in the west side starting down by the OLeary house, and generally, and I'll explain this in a little more detail in a minute, moving north and east, driven by a wind from the southwest. And the red is the area burned by the fire. Here we see the Saturday Night Fire. The fire leapt the south branch of the Chicago River and went north and east into the heart of the downtown, landing first over here at the Parmalee stables. It shows how the fire leaped. There was a tremendous updraft, so burning Chicago went up into the air and was blown north and east and landed in places and started all kinds of other fires. The first major one at Parmalee, and then the gasworks going on, and the fire moving generally this way. Next one, the downtown and the fire. You see how thoroughly in this red area the fire destroyed Chicago's commercial center at that time. You see the courthouse marked in particular on the same in the same block as City Hall is today. It was much smaller at that time. We see also such things not as when the way gunpowder was used by men named James Hildreth to try to stop the fire, with very mixed results. Earlier here and then later, a Sunday night over here and Monday afternoon over here. And again, we see the relation to the rest of the city. Then we move farther north into the North Division, and we see how much it destroyed of the north side all the way up to Fullerton, the northern border. Of course, it couldn't burn Lincoln Park as such. And at that point, Lincoln Park really began at Wisconsin Street and went for about half a mile. And below it was the city cemetery, where a lot of people took refuge. I want you to make note also of this area here. This is before the era of Streeterville, this area called the Sands, which figures as an escape place. Then we talk about such things as right after the fire and the beginnings of rebuilding, where the temporary city hall was way on the west side, and then another one down over here, the temporary police station over here, and various other things. What we also see, looking ahead a little bit, is where the July of 1874 fire came. The city did not take effective steps to prevent fire, and a second major fire burned through here. And the book talks about that and how insurance companies threatened to withhold insurance on the city as a whole. Over here is the site of the 1873 Interstate Exposition that I talked about before. And now, finishing the story, stepping back, a larger look of the map that we saw before of the city from farther away, we see that, among other things, that the fire hardly destroyed the whole city, but we see how much it absolutely took out the heart of the downtown and virtually all of the built-up area of the north side. Much of this was not built up at this time. Something like 13,300 of 13,800 buildings on the north side were burned. And we see here the footprint of the 1874 fire, and here of the the Saturday night fire. And here we see outlines of what is to come, where the Century of Progress and the so-called cultural campus exists today in this area here, built all on fill, and where the Columbian Exposition would be in 1893. Let me talk now about the kind of maps that the book talks about, and the kind of maps that I found in my research. First of all, is maps made right at the time by Chicago citizens trying to map the fire. This is one of the most charming ones in the collection of the Chicago History Museum, a map by a telegraph operator who lives on the north side, near where the DePaul campus in Lincoln Park is today. A man named Stephen Robinson, who just went out with an 1870 Rufus Blanchard map and walked around and drew the perimeter of the fire and what he saw still standing. And you see these annotations are kind of faint here over here. But if we look at close-ups, we see where he annotated them. He writes Ogden's house and barn. And what he means is Malin Ogden's house, one of the few buildings in the path of the fire that did not burn. It's now where the site of the Newberry Library is today. And he marked that. And then we look up toward Lincoln Park and the cemetery. The Catholic cemetery was actually below North Avenue. It's where the Cardinal's house is today. But if we look at the next detail, he marks these other things, the dredging buildings in Lincoln Park, like the dredging house, the pest house, the so-called where people who were ill were put in quarantine, and various other things. He says 4 houses west of Clark Street. This is the only record I've seen of these. But interesting, he writes the cottage at 17 Lincoln Place. That's over here. And that's the cottage of a policeman named Richard Bellinger, whose house also did not burn. It's now 2121 North Hudson. And what you see here is the outline that he drew of where the fire got to. Another man named Joel Bigelow, who was a Canadian-born tea merchant. I thought at first he was of the Bigelow Tea Company that we know today, but he's not. He wrote back to his brothers on October 10th, the day after the fire ended, about what had happened. And he included this wonderful hand-drawn map of the fire. And here we have see this where the Saturday night fire was. And it's very rough and so on. This is where he talks about all his losses, but at the end he says, isn't this a good time to invest and put some money in this place? This reminds me of a exercise I like to do with students when I taught a Chicago courses just at the beginning. Before we do anything else, is take out a piece of paper and draw what their view of Chicago. And of course, it has the bars and Wrigley Field and downtown in a very vague way, but not much else. And we try to fill it in as we go along. Then I was interested also in attempts to map the extent of the fire, so-called maps of the so-called burnt district. There are dozens and dozens of these, some ripped off from one another. This is from Sheehan and Upton's The Great Conflagration, an instant history published just a few months after the fire, with the orientation you see of north to the right here. But this shows, among other things, very well, not only things like where the cemetery is and so on, but how much of the north side, the built-up north side, was destroyed, and how completely the downtown was destroyed. We see this also in the Board of Public Works map, which seems to be hand-colored here, more official and sober map from the report of 1872, and other maps that more luridly use the color red to show the burnt district, to give a sense of it. Here, obviously, this is with north to at the top of the map. One of the most famous is this R.P. Studley Company map published for the benefit of the Relief Fund, and this went through many editions here. It's a large map that's, again, uses the color red, map showing the burnt district, and again shows how completely the north side was destroyed, how completely the downtown. I like this use of what Dennis tells me is a convention, the mile rings, to give you a sense of the scale of the fire, with the center being at the courthouse, again, where City Hall is today. And you just see it's like 4 miles. This has a big mistake in it, however. If you look at this part of the map, you would think at first this is where the fire began. But if you look in detail, in fact, DeKoven Street, where the fire began at the corner of Jefferson and DeKoven, the OLearys lived right about here, is over here. So this goes all the way down to Halsted and Canalport, and this is just plain wrong. And then there are these maps that try to do everything. This is a map of it's called Richard's Illustrated Statistical Map of Chicago and the Great Conflagration, again by the R.P. Studley Company, which has that fire map, the burnt district map here, but then has a kind of bird's eye view of the city on fire, taken from a map that was originally in Harper's Weekly and that was picked up by various other people, but then also scenes of the burned city up here. And on this side, facts about the city of Chicago, and over here, facts about the fire, and over here, great fires in modern times. So I'll try to being everything. I have a great fondness for this one, which is a fairly sober map, but it also has then on the side a John Greenleaf Whittier's not very good poem about Chicago and the fire printed here. So you get a twofer here. You get a map and a poem with this one. The next group of maps that I find very interesting are maps that try to map the rebuilding. This is one that was published a year after the fire in the Chicago Times, the leading paper in the city in the sense of the highest circulation. And again, north is to the right. It was then collected into a booklet that just basically took the text from that was in the daily paper and made it into a booklet called The New City. And this showed the rebuilding of the downtown. Among other things, it shows how fire rubble was used to fill that lagoon that had been there. The first step of fill that was later continued into the 20th century to make Grant Park as we know it, into the 21st century to make Millennium Park as we know it today. But this is not only interesting, it shows how much the city was rebuilt in such a short time. But what's also interesting is to compare it to another map, an 1862 map of the business district. And here I've turned the 1872 map to make north on the side, to put them side by side. But among the things we see from this map are that there are fewer buildings, but they are much larger now than they were before. They're not a lot higher, but they're have a bigger footprint than they did before, but also that the downtown is extending farther south. This was part of a trend that was already happening at the time of the fire. And this continues, we see this in other kind of mapping the downtown maps. This is an 1884 map of hotel and amusements and businesses, where we see things going on, and we see what it was still there until the early 1890s, the Interstate Exposition Building at Michigan Adams, and the developing what will be Grant Park, and the baseball grounds where the White Stockings played both before the fire and after. And then this continues on to a 1909 Chamber of Commerce map. And here you see how much farther the downtown extends and how Grant Park is being filled out all the more. The final group, oh, and one more thing from this period that I think a real favorite for a number of us, the 1892 Rand McNally map of bird's eye views of Chicago and guide to the city that was published in relation to the anticipation of business of the World's Columbian Exposition. And this kind of bird's eye view map with, again, developing Grant Park with the railroad tracks still very visible and still there, and then the lake just beyond those. What's circled here is another project I'm working on now, which is of the 1892-93 cyclorama of Chicago as it was burning. This will be out very soon. All of the final category of maps is mapping the progress of the fire itself. This took a long time. The first one that I know of is really not until 1940 in W.H. Moosham's long article on the fire in a historical journal for Illinois, where he maps them and he tries to show again this thing that the fire wasn't one fire but many, and think that it would lead from place to place and things would separate and combine and go in different directions. Dennis and Michael Konzen did a very effective update of this in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, which you see here. And what's so wonderful about this is that you see much better the fire over time. Here's the fire on Sunday night. Here, where it first starts on the west side, then into Sunday night through the downtown and part of the north side. But it also shows it's not really till Monday morning that it burns this part of the north side, this part of the south division, and this part of the north side. And it's not until later in the day that it gets to this part of the north side, and it's not till later in the day that it gets to this part of the downtown near where the auditorium building is now, and so on along the lakefront. Whoops, let me go back. And then not till Monday night that it gets to over here. All of these things are available now, not only in the book, but in the exhibition, online exhibition I curated for the Chicago History Museum, along with Northwestern Academic Technologies, The Great Chicago Fire and the Web of Memory. And you can find a lot of these things here, and they're very, very zoomable. Well, let me turn this over to Dennis now. And are you there, Dennis?
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't expect quite such an abrupt turnover. All right.
Well, I was trying to leave you. I'm sorry.
All right. Great Chicago Fire and the Web of Memory, the Encyclopedia of Chicago, for which this map was prepared. And this, of course, has an analog that is in the book that you showed a little bit earlier, although this one also tries to outline what was actually built up in Chicago at the time. And you can see that that is less than half of the city limits that is built up in the darker gray. So when people talk about how much of the city was destroyed by the fire, of course, we're used to hearing out-of-towners or newly arrived who talk about it having burned the whole town down. And we all know that that simply is not true, and we can show it graphically in maps like this one. Let's go on to the next one there. All right. Well, one of the things that I do want to emphasize is what a great pleasure it was to work on this book, not least because of the trust that Professor Smith placed in me. We've gotten to know each other much better during this project and find that we share a sort of responsibility to the future, to the readers, that at times, at least for me, borders on obsession. I really want to get it right. So even the background street pattern in the maps, the very straightforward maps in the book, is something that I want to get as accurate as possible. And one of the things that has popped up in the last 8 or 9 years as the American Geographical Society collection in Milwaukee has been scanning its holdings is the discovery of this 1872 map prepared by the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, most 19th century maps were made from the plats filed in the courthouse. And so they don't show if streets have been improved enough that we would recognize them as thoroughfares. You know, when even Michigan Avenue is still unpaved, what is the difference between an unimproved street and a street that should be shown on the map? Hard judgment calls. But the Corps of Engineers made some, and so therefore I considered this a much more trustworthy source for the street pattern. Though even in places I found that it disagreed with real estate records and had to make some judgment calls as I was working on the background street pattern. All right, the next. Tremendously helpful to this project was the discovery about 2/3 of the way through that there was an 1868-69 fire insurance atlas that had been prepared of Chicago. Now we knew of its existence because Chicago History Museum had some of the sheets, but they did not have a complete set. And the Leventhal Center at Boston Public Library, it turns out, had been busy digitizing their set and put them up on the web as we were working on these maps. So now I had the details of building footprints, street names, house numbers that we didn't always have from any other sources. And so I was so excited about those that I made a finding aid out of the key map and made that part of my Chicago in Maps page that will, I think we can go on to the next one. So these gave us the confidence in things like the shape and the position of various buildings. I think here you're seeing is it Crosbys Opera House that's in the center right, and I think there was a written description that was a little bit vague and made it sound like, well, was it on the corner of Washington State, or where exactly was it? But here was the documentary evidence needed to authoritatively draw the building footprint for things like that, or to work out exactly where the gas works were on the west side, which is a little vague in the written records, and to bring up questions that had to be resolved about the exact location of the houses that were dynamited in the South Loop, and make sure that we had those right on the map for the book.
For me, this was very interesting. I read about Crosby's Opera House, but I didn't understand where the entrances were and things like that. And this really made it so much clearer to me. It was a combined business and entertainment building.
All right, next. So this is only yeah, I think you see over to, sorry, I've got panelists hiding my screen in certain location, but one of the things that you see over to the right is 1868-69 pre-fire set of the fire insurance maps. And I have this finding aid on Chicago in Maps that links to all of these fire insurance maps that have been made available at various places on the web. The Library of Congress is the primary source, but Northwestern has a couple of volumes. University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana has been scanning their pre-1925 volumes. And I think there's one or two other places, as well as the ones that you can't link directly to, that you have to visit the Chicago Public Library or a similar library that has the privileges for the ProQuest set of microfilmed fire insurance maps. But a tremendous resource for genealogists, for urban historians, and for people like me working on maps for urban history books.
Dennis, is this site, I assume most of you know it, the Chicago in Maps is just absolutely magnificent. And it's got not only so much great stuff in it, but things like this, which give you guides to other great stuff. Next.
On to the next. Yeah,
Here
here's the home page, and I was working last night but didn't quite get finished to put a big link right here in the middle of this to the fire insurance maps, because that's by far the most visited part of the website, as even people at Chicago History Museum are using it day in and day out to access those.
It also takes you to such things as street change, street name, street number changes and stuff like that.
Also a project that I'm working on as winter falls again. I've been slowly scanning a book or well, we'll say the index card file that the city's Department of Maps and Plats kept for many decades that tells us all of the street name changes. And that, I think, will be a really useful tool for genealogists and urban historians in the future. All right, next. So back to the book. Every burnt district map that we consulted had slightly different boundaries. And so we had to decide which one to accept as canonical. You know, when you have the guy, it's a Robinson that goes out and does buy shoe leather, boot leather, the morning after the fire, you want to take that as gospel, but it didn't agree here and there with some other things. And so finally, after talking it back and forth for a week or so, I think we decided that that Bureau of Public Works map that they included in their 1871-1872 annual report is the one that we would trust the most, just the provenance of it and the officialness of it. And so that was, in the end, what the outline of the burnt district that I used on all the maps was.
That whole report of the Board of Public Works is available for free online. The book has got, it shows you how to find all the sources that it uses. So it's a great read. You can imagine what the report of the Board of Public Works was right after the Great Chicago Fire. Is basically, you won't believe what happened.
But is the map part of what's available online? You and I were talking about this last
yeah,
Sunday.
I'm not sure it's because it's folded in.
Right. And the copy that they have at Harold Washington Library, the Municipal Reference Collection, is damaged. I did some piecing together and Photoshop work to try to make it somewhat accurate. That might be something that I will go ahead and upload to Chicagoan Maps, just as an artifact of sorts.
And these are some of these. This is an enlargement from the book. These are places that are talked about in the book and people who are talked about. Next.
So this was one that I actually set for you to talk about. This is from 15 years after the fire, the 1886 Robinson fire insurance map of Chicago. These became available online as part of the Encyclopedia of Chicago. And so you can zoom in and look at these. And these are extremely helpful when you're trying to look at old addresses to track down things, exactly where a building was using the pre-1909 address. It turns out a little hiccup with that in the South Division, but anyway, that's one of the main uses of it. But the other reason that I had sent this to Carl thinking he might want to use it is that it tells a story that he's only hinted at, I think, in the presentation tonight, that the Germans of the North Side, the Nordseite, had the clout, we would say today, to get their area exempted from the city's new requirements that all buildings must be brick or stone. And so in 1886, in what we today call Old Town, you can see in yellow the shameful number of wooden buildings that are built in post-fire Chicago for reasons of political calculation and economy.
One of the major episodes in the book is the city council meeting of January 15th, 1872, when the council was about to, it was then called the Common Council, was then to discuss fire limits. And there was a march from people who lived in this area down through the LaSalle Street Tunnel to the temporary city hall at LaSalle and Adams, where the Rookery building now is, and completely got out of control, total melee And in fact, then after that, the fire limits were themselves limited. And this was basically all about ethnicity and class. And in very powerful ways, and creating a lot of resentments.
So those were the few slides that that I had sent on to include in tonight's presentation. You know, early in the project, there were dreams that maybe there would be some new scholarship that we could figure out to do in the maps. None of that in the end came to fruition. It would be great if we could somewhere discover a list of, for instance, where all the fire relief cottages had been located, and show and try to figure out if was a concentration of those. People who know Chicago know that a couple of them remain in Old Town, but there's probably another half dozen scattered around the city in the remnants of garages or on alleys where we would never spot them. And that would be an interesting mapping project to undertake. I think we did show where the few barracks that were built for relief were located, Washington Square and few other places around the city. But there certainly are future projects to be done with mapping what the Great Fire meant to Chicago.
It's entirely my fault and none of Dennis's that we didn't do more ambitious maps. I just want to make very clear here. I was dealing with a whole lot of other things, and,
Of course,
and the maps,
like all projects.
I must admit, were meant to make the text more legible, and they obviously tell their own story. But Dennis, as Dennis points out, there's so much more that can be done here. Well, I'm going to stop the sharing now, and Curtis, if you want to lead the Q&A.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that enlightening expose of a little bit on the Chicago fire and the mapping behind it a little bit. So we'll now go ahead and open things up to questions. If you'd like to submit a question via the chat box, you can also raise your hand, and I'd be happy to allow you to talk directly. Sorry, we're just trying to minimize talking over one another, so we're trying to keep that option limited. But feel free to submit questions either way. I'll get us started. Carl, when I read your book, you made it sound like the fire was really an inevitability. There was a couple of quotes. One was from the commission afterwards, where I forget who it was, but he said, you know, even if we had all the firefighters in the United States, we weren't going to be able to, or, you know, like beating this fire would have been questionable. The combustibility of the city. Would you agree that like Chicago was just due for a great fire, or was this really sort of a generational event?
I think it was due. I mean, first of all, the 19th century is full of fires, major fires. I mean, just 5 years before was the Great Portland Fire, which was the biggest one up to that time in Portland, Maine. And obviously it would continue on. But Chicago was just poised. It was as if it was built to burn. So much of it was built out of wood. The buildings were crowded together. The fire department was much too small. And then there were the particular circumstances of that season and those weeks, that is, say, an extraordinarily dry summer, a 24 fires in the week before the Great Fire, including that major one the night before that weakened the fire department, the wind from the southwest, and then a delay in the alarm system, which was otherwise state of the art, but somehow failed. So by the time the firemen got there, I think you could say that not all the fire in the world probably could have stopped it, especially once the water stopped pumping at around 3 a.m. when the roof of the pumping station fell in. But it was too much wind, too fast, too hot, indeed. And these predictions were made before the fire, not just after, and not just by the fire department, the fire commissioners, but by papers like the Chicago Tribune saying, we just can't do this. We have to take steps, but taking steps meant restricting a laissez-faire economy, telling people how they could use their property, and even more damaging, it meant raising taxes. And why should we worry about something that might happen? And to me, the most remarkable thing is, in after the city burned down, how little they did even then. And so finally, the insurance companies have to force it, and that fires just keep on happening. And you know, far worse in terms of loss of life is the Iroquois Theater fire of 1903. I tell that story too, including such things as that a man who was an acting fire department captain at the time of the Great Chicago Fire was chief at the time of the Iroquois fire, and he lost his job after 50 years in the department.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it does sound like it was a tinderbox, and the Great Chicago Fire could, as a series of.
Yeah, and it people obsess about who started it. The point is that any commonplace fire could have burned Chicago down. It was not some remarkable fire. It was just the most commonplace fire could do it given the other circumstances.
We got a question. Ron, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Yeah, okay, I was just curious. The books may have covered this subject, but the social aspects of the fire and what was said about the North Side Germans marching to protest in the city hall is in some ways similar to the anti-vaxxer movement that we're seeing even in this day, the opposition to government controls on personal freedom. I'm just wondering if Carl's book or other books cover these social aspects,
well,
and not just the
my book talks about it in great detail, and so does another book called Smoldering City by a woman named Karen Sodslak. But I would question the anti-vax parallel as such. The plea of the Germans and a lot of working people was that these fire limits were discriminatory against them, that they could only afford to build with wood and not with brick, and that their houses were not the ones that started this fire, and that the wealthy landowners downtown, who had some of them slumlords, were much more to blame. And I think the report and afterwards sort of verified that, and also that it was large property owners as well in many cases who didn't want any restrictions on how they could build. And the other complication is that while these fire limits were put into law with whatever limitations it had, they were not enforced. So they were kind of meaningless. And Chicago burned again and again in various ways. And it really, true fire prevention and protection is really a 20th century phenomenon.
Speaking of the source of the fire, we've got a question from Barbara. There is a documentary featuring Mrs. O'Leary's granddaughter, which focused on the impact of the accusations against her grandmother and her clumsy cow. Can you speak to a little bit as far as what the impact was on the O'Leary family?
Absolutely. Well, the book talks about that in depth. As I said, it begins and ends with them. And what I say at the end is that Mrs. O'Leary, the O'Learys were the fire's most enduring victims. They were scapegoated at the beginning. I testified at the exoneration of them in 1997 by the special committee of the city council, and then by the city council passed unanimously, that she was the perfect victim. It was a way to talk about the dangerous Irish among us. And reporters like from the Times would go and interview it only to make fun of her. And she's illiterate. She has no way to strike back. And it becomes a way to bash Irish immigrants in the city. And even the cruelest of all is when the reports, when she testified at the inquiry, and when she was nursing a baby at the time, how, it's a woman talking about how fat and disgusting a person she was and how ignorant her husband was. So it's, anyway, they moved largely to what we now know as the Bridgeport area, and lived out their life as best they could, mostly in anonymity, but reporters would seek them out on fire anniversaries and try to interview her, and she'd say no, and then they'd make fun of her. So he died in 1894, and she died in 1895. They lived at about 5000 South Halsted at that point, near the entrance of the stockyard. But it made her life miserable. She then, but as the book also talks about, she went from this scapegoat figure to this figure of kind of a positive folklore, that because Chicago was rebuilt and Chicago was so resilient, it became this kind of almost comical story. And she goes from this absolute scapegoat to this kind of, again, figure of folklore, but it's just as patronizing and condescending as in that Norman Rockwell painting, these that you see.
Did you ever?
But the book talks about that in length and talks about the social dynamics, the political dynamics, the workers, the strikes, and various other things during the rebuilding. People tried to keep, they wanted to keep the rents high, but wages low, property owners, for example.
Did you ever make contact with a member of her family, if they were ever existed?
I met a great-great-granddaughter, I believe, at the 1997 hearings, which were held in the Quinn Fire Training Academy, which is at Jefferson and DeKoven, which is on the block where the OLearys lived. Now it's where we train firemen for the city. It's one of the, I can't tell if it was purposeful, but it's one of the few examples of civic wit, I think, to put the training academy where the fire began. And there's you can go in there anytime, and there's a blocked off place on the floor that says, "Here the great fire began." Maybe.
David, I see you've got your hand up. Do you have a question for our presenters?
I do. Can you hear me? Ah, yes. Carl.
David, this is another person I've learned so much about Chicago from.
Oh, well, that's good. I just wondered if you mentioned anything about the simultaneous fires in Wisconsin.
Yes.
At the same time, because I have read that it is due to the abuse of wood, that too much wood was left about in the building of Chicago, and too much cut over land in Wisconsin was ripe to catch. And then there was that terrible fire. Was it Petoskey?
No, there were several fires that night, and again, all summer long. But that very same night, there was a fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, which is near Green Bay, and in Manistee, Michigan, but other places in Michigan. And the fire in Peshtigo area is to this day, I mean, if you accept such special cases as the World Trade Center, the single worst fire in American history in terms of loss of life. It's estimates I've seen between 1,100 and 1,500. And the way the fire just whooshed through this area, I think because of the wind and the dryness of the season. I don't know about the cutover area, but one of the things I talk about that fire and talk about how much worse it was, and also try to explain why the Chicago fire got so much more attention. And this gets into discussions of such things like the focus and development of America at this point. And Chicago is a center of the telegraph and of publishing and various other things. But the Peshtigo fire is terrible. Another story that's interesting here is that much of the area of that around there was owned by William B. Ogden, the entrepreneur extraordinaire of 19th century Chicago and the first mayor, who had a house in Chicago and this land in the Peshtigo area, but meanwhile was 65 years old and basically living in retirement in New York. And he lost his home and this town in the same night. And he came and worked for several weeks in various ways. Lost about a third of his fortune. He still had plenty left. But that's another interesting fire-related story that I tell. And a number of his letters are in the book too.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. I've got a question for Dennis.
I want to thank Jim Ackerman too, by the way, in the midst of all this, and Michael Conzen and others. But go on, and as well as David. But go on.
I do see Jim in the crowd. I'm sure he'll be appreciated. I'm not sure about Michael, but he led our talk last month and did a great job, and I'll be sure to pass that along. So Dennis, you were looking at these sandburn maps, which you were fortuitously able to come across digitally. So when you're building your maps or you're developing your information, do you have now like a repository of historical buildings and where they were located in Chicago? Like, we had spoken a little bit previously talking about beer maps or, various sorts of things. And I was just wondering if you could, like, what sort of information do you have about historical maps of Chicago outside of your website that you're sitting on?
Well, when I worked on the Encyclopedia of Chicago 20 years ago, that was an opportunity for me to kind of build up my own modest map collection of Chicago. And then maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I decided that perhaps I should build a website that would help people to find what was already out there on the web, but that nobody would really think to look for at, say, the University of Alabama, but because of an alumnus of that university, it turned out that they had scanned and put online a number of their 19th century Chicago maps. So I think that I worked very hard for Chicagoan Maps to link to everything from the 19th and early 20th century that is out there on the web about Chicago, and even some hard to find modern day stuff. As far as building up a database, that is not so much the historic sites as it is the street network, the street pattern. And so what I have come to do for several periods is to to take the modern street network of the city, and by comparing it with period maps, kind of restore it to what I think it actually was in some specific years. For instance, 1940 for a pre-expressway city, and 1900 or thereabouts. And so this was another opportunity because we had this seemingly very trustworthy map from the Army Corps of Engineers for 1872 that I thought I could restore or create a street network of 1871 thereabouts that was quite trustworthy. And because I have those on known projection, known scale, if I actually did want to map a large number of addresses, the tools are there for the computer to do a lot of that work for me. Mapping specific buildings as detailed as, the Crosby Opera House or Vorwert's Hall, that's the sort of thing that I have to dive into the fire insurance maps about, because sometimes the written record will frustratingly say, oh, on the corner of 16th and Halsted, and I need to know which corner of 16th and Halsted.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, I just wanted to get a little sympathy from me. As I said, I read hundreds of accounts of the fire, and Musham talks about this, they disagree with each other like you wouldn't believe, about when this happened, where it was, and that sort of thing.
Well, thank you. That's very interesting. Speaking of those accounts, I know we're at our hour mark, and feel free again, if you've got any questions to send them in the chat or raise your hand. I don't want to monopolize, but with regards to the aftermath, so you've got General Sheridan imposing martial order. You used what I felt like is a quintessential Chicago term of accidental murder of an individual downtown. So reading all of these accounts, what's your take on the aftermath? Was it a scene?
Is it time?
What's your take on whether or not it's was it a scene of chaos and lawlessness and looting, or was, could Chicago have taken care of itself in the aftermath, and was martial law trampling of civil rights?
Well, first of all, let me just tell you that that's dealt with in great detail in the book. Sheridan was already a resident of Chicago as head of the Fourth of the Army, which basically were fighting Indians in the West, Native Americans in the West. And he was almost pressed by the nervous, again, this Protestant elite to take over. He was sort of, in many ways, he didn't want to do it and was sort of forced to do it. And they're very worried about looting and so on. There is some crime, some looting, but there's much more wild rumors of all of this. And he comes to command a kind of makeshift force of a few thousand people, which are some regular troops, which basically protect the downtown area, where there are safes and other things that are out in the rubble, and volunteers more around the perimeter, including a group called the Chicago Cadets, the University Cadets from the University of Chicago, and a 19-year-old University of Chicago student who never fired a gun in his life from Wisconsin accidentally confronts a prominent Chicago citizen and kills him when the person refuses to stop. And the martial law ends. The police always said we could handle it. There probably was not a need for this. It was more to calm the public mind. It wasn't so much a violation of individual rights. There wasn't a lot of complaint on that, but of states' rights. The governor of Illinois said, you can't, this is de facto martial law. You can't send an army, a federal general to do it. And I said, we could have handled it. We could have done it with the state militia. And it became an argument along those lines, complicated by the fact that there was a tension between this governor and Sheridan that went back to the Civil War. So it's just a complicated mess. So there is this period of disorder, but more a period of fear that this underclass would now be free to go run wild. And there are all kinds of stories even of arsonists running wild, and then stories of righteous citizens lynching them. And pictures of this in the book. None of this is true, but it's more to calm the public mind and to enforce curfews and things like that for a while. But that lasts basically 2 weeks, and then the local police are back in charge. And there's too few of them too. And they're pretty valiant in their own way, because a lot of them are burned out. They have no homes. A lot of the firemen are burned out. They have no place to go. And meanwhile, there's this, the city. But the actual disorder is fairly limited.
Thank you. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll let everyone go for the evening. Carl, Dennis, thank you both again for sharing your excellent research and expertise. I'm excited to see what comes of the panorama, cyclorama, I guess.
It should be up and running in a week or two, and I will send you a link that you can send to the members. Again, let me emphasize that this was specialized talk by a amateur in terms of maps, that I think a lot of this kind of social history that people are looking for and individual experience is in the book and tries to tell the story in all its richness.
Absolutely. Again, it can be found at independent local booksellers, which we all approve and suggest, as well as online. So thank you all again for your time this evening. And we'll have more to come on it soon. Again, next month, the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire.
Thanks to all. Thank you, Curtis. Thanks to all of you. And thanks to Dennis.
Thank you all. Yeah, I hope everybody has a great evening, and we'll talk to you all again soon.